No time like the present to get back into this very thorough fact-checking of Abigail Shrier's Bad Therapy. And we're not even to the Bad Therapy chapter yet of Bad Therapy. That comes after a crisis in the era of therapy, which we will be starting now. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Welcome, welcome. And if you're new, I'm Cass, your soon-to-be favorite cognitive psychologist on YouTube. Cognitive is not a part of counseling psychology. So not only am I not your counseling psychologist, I am no one's counseling psychologist. What I am is a trained scientist with a plan. Go through Bad Therapy, dig through the ample references, and see how things shake out. Do things sift through as solid articles described accurately? Or are things getting stuck in the sieve for whatever reason? Drop nuance, misrepresenting findings, and many more we'll see. This chapter, as mentioned, is about the crisis in the era of therapy. What crisis? Good question. Something Shrier will eventually get around to answering, albeit in a manner much more expediently than Jordan Burnt Peterson ever seems to. We'll get through the first 18 of the 68 total endnotes, references, citations in this video. As you'll see, it seems like Shrier tries to play fast and loose in a couple places, or omit citations in the middle of many others. Tricky, tricky. While we're here, I'll mention that the first endnote just explains that names of many people have been changed to protect them from any potential consequences of talking to Shrier. Okay, final YouTube business before we start. This video was sponsored by many of you kind folks through the stuff in the description box. Patreon, Fourth Wall, PayPal donos, all of those things help make this work possible. You can also help me out by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, please thank you, and telling me where you settle on the ham debate if you partake in ham, or even if you don't. Should ham be glazed in all the wonderful glory with the clothes and everything, or do you like it naked if you eat ham? We have an ongoing debate that's stalemated in this house about whether or not it should be lovingly glazed or naked. Tell me what you think. You can also help support the channel by picking up some merch. You can stay warm and specifically correct in your pedantic pants. Get a citation needed mug to hold your hot cocoa or hot toddy, you do you, and stickers to also help keep you warm somehow. Fourth Wall link below. Finally, as a quick refresher for the visual cues I use to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm talking science, or am in the dirt with Shrier's references where sometimes we can find some science. This means I'm paraphrasing the book, and this means I'm integrating all of that with my own commentary. Right, we have some serious ground to cover, so let's get started. I will mention this here, so it stands a better chance of being seen, since some people skip the formatter. Guilty. Also, so it doesn't trip up something with the bots. Content advisory. The general concept of suicide will come up in this video, including the subtopics of ideation or attempts. We won't be going into specifics on these, instead focusing on things like statistical rates or risk factors, and I don't think this should be too terribly triggering at this high and impersonal level, but just so you know, this will be popping up a couple times in this video. This chapter starts with something that's going to be a minor feature of this book. Interviews with youths who give Shrier the perfect sound bites. Now, in pointing this out, I am not trying to imply that Shrier is fabricating interviews. Just that, in this ever-expanding population on this planet, odds are pretty good that you'll be able to find a handful of people with the opinion that you're trying to bolster.
It's true.
It's true.
It's true.
Especially if you are sourcing your interview participants from previously existing contact networks, which were built up while writing your previous anti-trans book, as is my suspicion. Regardless, 16-year-old Nora is a student at a SoCal private high school with loads of friends and is super cool and connected. Wait a minute. Later in this book, Shrier mentions that she lives in a fancy SoCal neighborhood. It's not outside the realm of possibility that Nora is a friend's daughter. She casually chats with Shrier about all the problems her friends have, pausing the flow a moment to point out that it seems like Shrier is being sneaky here. She includes dissociative identity disorder, or DID, gender dysphoria, autism, and Tourette's as being on Nora's, quote, list of once rare disorders that are, among this rising generation, suddenly not so rare at all. It strikes me as odd that she breaks from more run-of-the-mill disorders, like anxiety or depression, to what seem like big categories of, I have this disorder TikToks, especially because she's going to lean in on the faking angle pretty hard. We're going to set aside the potential nuanced minefield of 3 of these and focus on Tourette syndrome. It is incredibly easy to get lost in the weeds talking about DID and autism, and I think I've made my case for gender dysphoria in talking about Shrier's previous book, Irreversible Damage. Also, Tourette's is different in this little clumping of hers because a diagnosis requires observable behaviors. For a diagnosis of Tourette's, a person must have motor and verbal tics that have lasted for at least a year and have this start before they are 18. Further, the cause of these tics need to not come from another source, like from a medication or other medical condition. Motor tics can range from small things like blinking, eye rolling, or a slight muscle jerk, up to more complex things like jumping or some simulated physical action. Likewise, verbal tics range from smaller things like a cough or sucking noise to actual words or phrases. If a person doesn't have both motor and verbal tics, it's not Tourette's. Those are separate tic disorders. It's only Tourette's when you have both. As mentioned, this disorder shows up before adulthood, and while the severity can get pretty gnarly around 10, give or take, it tends to get better with age after that, if not disappearing altogether. This disorder is one I'm pretty familiar with because my dad had it. He was diagnosed in his mid-30s, shortly after I was born. In his adulthood, his tics were a relatively minor head and neck movement and a slight verbalization of I. He said when he was younger, the head movement was much more violent, just like jerking his head back out. Consistent with the literature, he described the feeling before a tic happened as being similar to the sensation you have before a cough. You can try to suppress it, but if your body wants it to happen bad enough, it's going to come out. In all the times he interacted with Mr. the boyfriend, he was able to suppress his tics, although those meetings were generally maybe a couple hours tops. The tics would be more difficult to control in periods of high stress and would sort of just fade away when he was fully engaged in a pleasurable task, like playing music. I have mixed feelings for the videos I've seen circulated of people purporting to be faking having Tourette's. On the one hand, yeah, it does seem like some people are faking it for whatever reason. I'm not going to name names, but to my familially trained eye, it does seem like some people are doing a performance, and a bad one at that. And to be frank, I have some pretty strong negative feelings about that. My dad was accused of faking it for attention by his teachers, beaten by his father for not knocking it off, and regularly socially ostracized for it, even as an adult. I guess that the majority of people who are doing this type of content, who are actually faking having Tourette's, don't experience any of those real-world negative consequences because they can turn it off. Like, they may get negative comments on their TikToks or whatever, show up in cringe compilations, and probably get the internet hate machine and death threats and all that. Don't say they deserve that, but, the real world social consequences that my dad experienced, it's not a part of their life, I would guess. We have some crazy kitty activity. But on the other hand, if we take a step back and look at the situation, it becomes a question for me. Why are they doing this? There's going to be max noises in the background, I'm sorry. A minority are quite possibly clout goblins, using the disorder as a way to get more eyes on their account and get internet points. We're going to set those ones aside, like very, very aside. And the rest, I would guess, hope that they're doing it as a way to find some belonging and sense of community, and maybe even feel a little bit special because the prevalence of Tourette's is about 1% of the population. So then a follow-up question is, what would need to change in their lives for them to stop? And if they're doing it out of some variant of loneliness, that is a problem in our modern society and something we need to work to address. To the point that the US Surgeon General put out an advisory last year about the, quote, urgent public health issue, because it is. it's not just a matter of people being kind of sad, it can have striking consequences for people's health, not just their sense of well-being. The advisory included a framework for addressing this, including things like bringing back non-profit-driven community spaces or forcing social media companies to change their algorithms to get people off their damn phones all the time. Dream big, right? Maybe if these people felt more sincere connection with those around them, they wouldn't be desperately, inauthentically chasing it online. But back to Shrier. We're spending a little bit of time here because the central thrust of this book is that the youths aren't as psychologically disordered as is commonly thought, with the not conspiracy-aligned subtext being that the kids are faking it, either for attention, for an oppression-based identity, for a way to break the social contract in some way. We focused in on Tourette's, in part because of my dad, but also because in our bullshit bundle, it's the one with external diagnostic criteria. The exact particulars for a person developing Tourette's hasn't been pinned down yet, and the neurological differences are also a bit nebulous. But we do know that there is some heritability to it, and the brain areas involved. I can definitively say that this disorder is not transmitted socially. What can be transmitted is knowledge about what the cause of the tics are, that it's some abnormal neural activity and it has a name. That information would have been huge for my dad when he was younger. Poking at autism and gender dysphoria yields similar results. Hearing somebody talking about experiences that you've had, quite possibly for your entire life, and finding out that it's a thing, it has a name. Finding out that you aren't some freak gifted with a singular hellish experience. There are others like you, and that in itself can be a relief, but also finding out that there are ways to cope, maybe even thrive with it. Also, as with Tourette's, the exact hows and whys haven't been worked out, but we do know they have a biological basis. These are physically real. Even expanding back out to Shrier's favorites of anxiety and depression, those have a neurological basis. Albeit these disorders are ones that take more influence from environmental factors, a la shit life syndrome. Some of the teenage Nora's friends are in therapy, some are on psychiatric meds. Quote, I ask Nora what seems to be troubling her friends. Nora reiterates that they're going through, quote, really hard things. But when I ask her what, she is vague. Strained relationships with peers, breakups, disagreements with parents. Shrier sees this vagueness as indicative of something she's noticed about modern teens. Their communication is, quote, more constant, largely digital, and, even among teen girls, far more superficial than it was a generation ago. Less bearing of souls, more trading of memes. Quote, even to their best friends, they communicate only this, that they are going through something bad and serious, something that will require their friends' sympathy and indulgence. Shrier gives no indication of how she knows this about teens' communications, just that it's true. Because she's saying it. I see a couple alternate explanations, assuming this is true. The teens she's talking to might not feel that comfortable just sharing all of their friends' dirt with her, this random adult. The vagueness she's getting from them may be by design, as a way to not divulge things said in confidence, not indicating that they don't know these things. Given my unsupported hunch for how Shrier is coming into contact with these teens, their families may share similar biases to hers, including therapy bad. The teen may agree with the sentiment, they might disagree, they might not have an opinion either way because they haven't thought about it. In any event, the vagueness could be reflecting a superficiality, but not about the communication itself, just their understanding of the problem. Finally, to say the obvious, these are teenagers. Problems with peers, breakups, fights with the parental units are huge problems. Albeit the problems of a somewhat sheltered teen who isn't having to worry about their parents' finances, healthcare access, or war. I throw climate change in there as the fourth modern horseman of the apocalypse, but he comes up later this chapter. That Nora is saying that these are the things teens are struggling with doesn't mean that the teens aren't communicating well. It might just mean that Nora didn't see the point in telling Shrier that Becky broke up with Ash because Ash kind of made out with Ray at that one party, but then Ray has feelings. Seems like there's a bit of a jump from the teens' vague relaying in interviews to teens' vague sharing between themselves. What level of specificity would Shrier need to hear from these teens for her to retract the superficiality claim? I suspect the reality is this is a catch-22. What we've seen here? Superficial. If the teen shared every ounce of detail, Shrier would probably spin that into something bad too. Nora, quote, confesses to Shrier that some will use their, quote, mental issues, quote, like a conversation piece. It's almost like a trend. See what I meant about the sound bites? This is related to one of my alternate explanations for the superficial nature of these conversations. I was once, long ago now, a teen dealing with a mood disorder, anxiety, and trouble with my parents. The one time I opened up to a friend about the depression, I confirmed she wasn't really a friend. At that point, it had seemed like she'd already mostly checked out of the friendship and we were just hanging out, as I don't even know why. So telling her this was kind of an act of desperation, and it was like a switch flipped. She was instantly interested in asking me questions, but like in a freak show kind of way. It was incredibly unnerving. As part of it, I mentioned the self-harm, and her face lit up and she had to know more. Why did I do it? Could she see what I'd used? Is it nearby? Could she see the scars? Ugh. Consequently, I didn't mention this to anyone until I was pretty deep in my relationship with Mr. the Boyfriend. It was pretty apparent to me that this was not something to talk with your friends about, even close ones. So then we've got Nora telling Shrier that she thinks some people are only doing this because it's trendy. It's not hard for me to imagine Nora's friends getting weird responses from her when opening up about why they're in therapy or on psychiatric meds and just, we're not going to talk with you about that further. Nora says those without some sort of psych disorder feel left out, that it's expected and normalized to have them. We're throwing this over here because we can talk about what normalization means in this context. According to the U.S. National Institutes of Health, the most common psych disorder in 2023 was anxiety, sitting just under 20% of the population, followed by major depression at 8.3%. Hopping over to a different chart from the NIH itself, the past year prevalence for any psych disorder in adults for 2022 was 23.1%. That is not a majority. But Cass, maybe it's different in teens. Well, depression and anxiety rates did increase for youths in the wake of COVID-19, reaching roughly 25% and 20% respectively, according to a meta-analysis in JAMA Pediatrics. If we assume anxiety and depression are separate populations, which is a majorly conservative assumption here, because they tend to co-occur or are comorbid with each other. Like, if somebody has anxiety, chances are they also have depression. And these two co-occur with enough frequency that some researchers are questioning if this isn't just tapping the same underlying cause. If they're separate populations, that would mean that 45% of American youth have dealt with anxiety or depression since 2020. Those numbers experiencing anxiety and or depression are nothing to sneeze at. I've lived there since my youth. It's not great, but that's not the new normal. Apologies to whoever I'm going to crib this idea from. If you recognize it and know who said it, tell me in the comments and I'll pin it so they get the credit. The gist is that Shrier, in all of her conservative glory, perceives any deviation from the traditionally accepted norms as too much. Any visibility or dare to dream acceptance of transgender non-binary people means that we have been ideologically captured by the alphabet brigade. Likewise, the educational initiatives to make the public more aware of psych disorders and treatments, as well as attempts to, yes, normalize having one, is interpreted as the progressives having gone too far and are now tainting the precious, innocent, carefree youths with maladies they don't have. Both these, plus countless other topics in the culture war, want the listener to believe the conservative baseline. That people, in their natural state, aren't psych disordered, or trans, or wanting to get an abortion, or get a divorce from their abusive spouse. That is purely the result of progressive propaganda. However, that discounts and dismisses many people's reality. They do have a psych disorder like anxiety, depression, or any of the others. They are trans. They do want to yeetus the fetus or rouse the spouse. Maybe it feels weird to a teen who isn't struggling with anything to see how many of their peers are. But maybe, just maybe, the thing to do wouldn't be to tell the Noras of the world that, yeah, their peers really aren't going through it. They've just been led to think they are. They're fine. Quote, I ask her why it's depressing to have friends who are struggling. Nested quote, I know 3 people who are committed to mental facilities long term. 1 who committed suicide, she says. All of them high school students. And we're skipping a paragraph about how super normal and untroubled Nora is. Back to Shrier. But she also casually bundles 2 sets of friends as if they are one. Those whose mental illness is so profound that it requires psychiatric commitment, and those who are seeking explanations for their unhappiness and discovering diagnoses. Like so many young people I talk to, she regards high school friends with exam anxiety or social phobia as existing on merely one end of a psychological continuum that terminates with the woman who shows up naked to Target. You can fuck all the way off with this bullshit, Shrier. Maybe you'd fuck off so far that you can grow an ounce of decency from how far you fucked yourself away. There is one Nora is a normie paragraph separating Nora talking about knowing people who've been committed or died by suicide, and this distasteful comment about someone seeming to be in some sort of psychotic episode. Real fucking witty there, Shrier. Good job. If this super normal Nora is talking about knowing this many peers who are clinically going through it, maybe it's actually a problem? Could we entertain that idea? Although, I guess Shrier does, in her way. Separating people into her 2 favorite bins, those who legitimately have a problem and those who don't, with her as the arbiter of where the boundary lies. Because it can't be something with nuance, right? That people with test or social anxiety are at the relatively more livable end of anxiety compared to the person with agoraphobia who can't leave their house. The really fucked thing is her not that bad examples can be pretty detrimental and life-altering if they go unaddressed, but are also something that can be improved. Social anxiety disorder, which she's calling social phobia, is a fairly common variant of anxiety, because anxiety comes in more flavors than just generalized. Contrary to the definition Shrier seems to use, it's more than just being painfully shy. This can reach the point where the person becomes physically ill because of the physiological stress they're going through from the anxiety, which may result in them just avoiding social situations altogether. Treating this anxiety disorder can be through some combination of therapy and medication, which will probably result in a huge improvement in their quality of life. Likewise, test anxiety is a highly specific form of anxiety. There's 2 components to it, the thoughts and the bodily reaction. These thoughts can include fears of failing the test, doom spirals because of the predicted failing test score, and the blanking out of everything that had been studied despite studying. Physiological responses include a racing pulse, sweating, and stomach upset. And there's many things that can be done to support somebody with test anxiety, which line up with the wheels I invented, or probably reinvented, for myself and my students. Once my classes got the slightest bit challenging and I couldn't just breeze through it, I found out what test anxiety was like. The fear of failing to live up to my gifted potential, whatever that was going to be, was too much for me, and the anxiety response would kick in. I'd be shivering and my brain would just all gone. Sometimes it was a wonder I could get my name on the stupid thing. The silver bullet for me, and something that helped some of the undergrads I taught, was to just let it happen. You get the test, you read the first couple questions, and whoa, the panic anxiety response happens. Just let it happen. Do some breathing exercises, doodle, think of puppies and kitties, whatever you need to do to just get your calm, get your vibe back down, and it'll pass, and then you can take the test. It might cost you 5-10 minutes, but it's better than brute forcing the knowledge and just making sure it stays stuck. It super sucks to have to go through that for each and every test, so there are some preventative things you can try if you aren't already, and check out my studying video for tips on that if you are struggling. But sometimes, even with the best prep, the panic anxiety kicks in and it sucks. And if that happens, just refer back to my chill vibes approach. If you're doing the test prep and you're trying the chill vibes and it's still not enough, talk to your accessibility office at your school for accommodations. Seriously. Sometimes test anxiety can be triggered by the environment you're taking the test in, like all the student noises of paper rustling and coughs and sneezes. Like, sometimes that's enough to trigger the test anxiety, or if your anxiety response takes more than 5 or 10 minutes to subside, there goes your test time. Contrary to what I'd guess Shrier's advice would be, to brute force your way through this and hope for the best, quite possibly ending up dropping out of school in the process because it feels hopeless, thereby confirming the anxious negative self-talk that you are as dumb as you'd feared. Accommodations for this problem exist and are pretty easy for schools to do. Yeah, it takes a little time and coordination and space, but this is something they should be doing for their students. Getting back to Shrier's point, she's only technically correct that tests or social anxiety probably aren't on the other end of this continuum, but only because high-key anxiety doesn't tend to result in the person literally exposing themselves in this way. That sounds more like some sort of disconnection from reality, more associated with things like schizophrenia or a manic phase in bipolar. But that is missing Shrier's incredibly wrong point. The subtypes of anxiety she's touched on here, or depression seen in youths, are of the same disordered space as grown-up psych problems. For most disorders, we don't go through some butterfly metamorphosis where the adult version of us suddenly has mental health problems baby us didn't have. Maybe they were already floating around our head as a teen. Maybe there was only the predisposition for it, and onset happened with the stresses and experiences of adulthood. In either case, the teens aren't faking it, nor have they caught it socially. Fucking listen to young people when they say something is wrong with them. Don't just dismiss them because of their age. Quote, "The mental health establishment has successfully sold a generation on the idea that vast numbers of them are sick. Less than half of Gen Zers believes their mental health is good. They do not believe mental health is something that arises typically in the normal course of a balanced life, but like a boxwood tree, requires constant tending by the gardener you hire to prune it." Reference 2 is a summary of the American Psychological Association 2018 Stress in America Survey Report, which was actually directly referenced by Shrier in the intro. I don't know why she's adding this complexity and, removal from the source material. It's the same info. This figure is from the current reference. And on the left portion, we've got the percentage of the different age bins reporting, quote, "very good or excellent mental health." While 45% is less than half, as per Shrier's claim, there's a finicky detail here that changes things. Going back to the original 2018 report, we can see they've only included numbers for those reporting their mental health as fair or poor, 27% of Z, and excellent or very good, 45%. This suggests to me they used a Likert scale. Those things where it's multiple choice with options ranging from bad to good, low to high, etc. I've got a mock-up table of what I imagine the options were on screen now. If my assumption about the Likert scale are correct, we can work out the proportion of Zers who said their mental health was good. Could be better, could be worse. These meh, it's okay respondents would drastically shift Shrier's claim about this. Subtracting out the 27% with not good, and the 45% with some form of great, we're left with 28% in the middle camp. If I am correct about the existence of the good bin in the middle there, and I am certain I am, then Shrier's claim from this data about, quote, "less than half of Gen Zers believe their mental health is good," is flat out wrong. It's not less than half, it's almost 3/4 of the youths thinking that their mental health is at least good. I suppose that idea, that about 1/4 of Zoomers think their mental health isn't okay and this is big therapy's fault, doesn't quite rattle the parental cages as much. Or support the reappearance of her conspiracy-brained mental health establishment that is doing this to boost profits or ideologically enslave the youths or whatever. Also unsupported is his last bit about youths believing their mental health needs to be cultivated. It's not in this reference to summary of the 2018 report, and it's not in the 2018 report itself. It's a claim sourced right up Shrier's ass. The closest I could find for this particular claim is an 8-year-old systematic review on the beliefs of youths about mental health, services, and care. Basically, youths, and adolescents in particular, had a pretty negative and stigmatized view of mental health conditions, the care available, and, interestingly, psychiatrists. GPs and psychologists were more okay, but not psychiatrists. Part of this may be due to their mental health literacy being largely informed by the media. And how often is a psychiatrist not portrayed as some sort of sadistic psychopath? Rounding things out, medication was viewed negatively and seeking help was viewed as a sign of weakness. These patterns line up with other studies looking at the mental health literacy of adults around the world, as well as older studies, all of which suggests that the mental health stigma needle hasn't really moved much in decades. Altogether, unless there's been a massively drastic shift in the past 8 years, these seem to blow a pretty damaging hole in Shrier's claims here. Loads of people believing their mental health struggles to be caused by anything but the currently understood mechanisms avoid seeking treatment. Because of the stigma, because of fear of seeming weak, because of poor understanding and what the treatment would actually be. This is hardly the public being sold on the idea that they're sick. Youths were particularly unlikely to see themselves as having a psych disorder, unless they had a close family member who went through it. We already talked about the mathematical error on her less than half think they're okay claim. And while I can't seem to find something talking about beliefs for untroubled mental health, it seems to be the case that around the world, people perceive psych disorders as aberrant and not something that should be admitted or discussed. Going back to the conservative-centered normalcy rant earlier, this last sentence carries a similar vibe. How could anyone believe that mental health isn't something that you just have? With the subtext being that that is the good, godly way to be, and if you're struggling with your mental health, it's because you've fallen short of his light, or you aren't willpowering yourself into at least acting like you're fine. Everything's fine. She is making getting through this chapter with any sort of speed impossible. Next part, the rest of the section really, is Shrier throwing a bunch of statistics, numbers, and references at us. So we're going to dispense with the literary flair and look at the claim she's made, what the reference says, and if it supports it or not. Plus my occasional, minuscule monetary contributions throughout. Claim, quote, nearly 40% of the rising generation has received treatment from a mental health professional, compared with 26% of Gen Xers. Reference 3 is the same as 2. The summary of the 2018 Stress in America survey. Yes, 37% of Zoomers had some sort of, quote, treatment or therapy from a psychologist or other mental health professional, which are comparable rates to millennials, but outpacing the older generations. I am curious if this includes school counselors, though. Given the shift to try to address the growing mental health crisis proactively in schools, especially for kids who would otherwise not have access to help, it makes sense that the younger generations would have had more exposure. Hell, I talked to the middle school's counselor when it became apparent I was going through it in 8th grade. To the mom of that terrible friend I mentioned earlier. Middle school sucked. Regardless, this point is basically correct, although I will comment on her somewhat deceptive rounding with the Zoomers in a possible attempt to broaden the gap. Claim, quote, 42% of the rising generation. What is with this rising generation language? Calm down, Abigail. Quote, 42% of Gen Z, quote, currently has a mental health diagnosis, rendering normal increasingly abnormal. And note 4 contains 2 references. The first is a bit of a, I don't want to say rabbit hole, more like a mildly annoying fetch quest to get to the actual source. Shrier has cited a post on the site Study Finds, a website with the goal of distilling down scientific findings into bite-sized pieces the lay readership could use, and are very proud they're only supported through ad revenue. The 42% figure is in the first sentence of the Study Finds summary of a Harmony Healthcare IT survey of 1,000 Gen Z. Harmony Healthcare IT is a company that primarily works on healthcare data management stuff, especially legacy systems, the out-of-date ones. This 2022 survey is filed under the blog portion of their website. To get it out of the way, yeah, this has the 42% mental health diagnosis in this sample. Maybe it would have been better to call this a rabbit hole. In trying to find out anything on how the survey was run, I hit a weird snag. At the very bottom of the post, there's finally the kernel of methodological info. Below the bare minimum of important things. That 1,055 Gen Zers, aged between 18 to 24, mean 22, were surveyed about their mental health. No clue how respondents were recruited or if they were reimbursed for their time in any way. No idea how long the survey was, what the exact nature of the questions were, or how they were administered, but hey, at least we get the gender breakdown. But then there's contact info, and it's not pointing to Harmony Healthcare IT. It's going to digitalthirdcoast.net. That's weird. Digital Third Coast does digital PR, search engine optimization, and, quote, paid media. The website includes somewhat anonymized client case studies, such as a sequence of projects for a healthcare IT and data management firm. You know, like Harmony Healthcare IT. Basically, this IT and data company, who may or may not be Harmony Healthcare, was having too many people hit up their blogs and dipping before engaging with the actual products of the site. So this advising company had them change the blog format to include, quote, on-page optimizations. If we go back and look at the survey post on the Harmony Healthcare site, you can see the Contact Us button always visible up top, and the sidebar trying to get you to sign up or, quote, talk to the experts, although those don't follow you down the page. You may be thinking, what's the big deal, Cass? One company hired the services of another company to optimize their search engine results. Not exactly Pulitzer-level work here, and you'd be correct. But the lack of authorship info on the IT site besides this weird, quote, for media inquiries, please contact media@digitalthirdcoast.net has me wondering if this wasn't done in-house by the, to say it again, legacy healthcare IT and data management firm, as it would arguably be outside their company's skill set. Mayhaps it was this PR company instead. Digital Third Coast, DTC for short, has a digital PR arm. They, quote, create research-based content with a proven track record of high quality and high authority links. We build brand awareness and create content that helps your brand balance relevance with newsworthiness. Our seasoned team of digital PR experts know how to craft search-optimized copy designed to reach your audience and impress Google, while tackling active media outreach campaigns capable of newsjacking the trickiest of news cycles. Their content research and production offers research-based campaigns, including surveys, that are SEO'd and have share-worthy graphics. Let's learn a little more. The client chooses a topic, and these guys get to work on generating the needed content. But don't you worry, quote, quality is king. They use, quote, proprietary surveys, in addition to things like the US Census, then massage their data into, quote, content designed to earn inbound coverage. Part of that comes from the, quote, eye-catching visual graphics, as can be seen in the Healthcare IT survey page. They promise they can do any and all research topics in 4 to 6 weeks, including delivering the graphics. I tried to find just fucking anything about their proprietary survey process, but that information isn't there. What was there in their blogs was a primer on newsjacking, where you take advantage of something starting to blow up in the news cycle, getting quick with your own posts about it, quite possibly utilizing their digital PR survey and graphics team to drive traffic to your site under the guise of having an expert opinion on that popular topic. Now, I am not legally claiming that this IT and data management company newsjacked their way into broader discourse, such as a bite-sized content aggregator like, Study Finds, in a cynical attempt to drive business traffic to their site. Definitely can't prove it with any certainty. What I am saying is this digital PR company did work with some healthcare IT and data management company who was having difficulty converting blog traffic to their site into sign-up or sales, and had the IT company change the layout to include more conversion buttons, as can also be seen on the Harmony Healthcare blog posts. This digital PR company will do proprietary surveys about topics sent to them by the client and provide key summaries and graphics for the client to use. Example graphics are similar to those on the Harmony Healthcare blog posts, and Harmony Healthcare gives no indication as to how the surveys were conducted. This digital PR company tries to newsjack topics to drive traffic to their clients' websites. The mental health of the youths was a newsworthy concern in the wake of COVID-19, and a 42% Zoomers with psych disorders finding is very clickable. In my opinion, overall, I find this survey and its results suspect. Because so little information is given, we don't know what their inclusion or exclusion criteria were. easy way to bias data and produce something that will jack the news cycle. We don't know how people were recruited. Some spaces have disproportionate representation of certain groups. If you find a space that has a lot of mental health discussions, any samples from that aren't going to be representative of the general population. Given the nature of the closed box proprietary surveys this PR company does, it seems possible, maybe even probable, that questions are posed in such a way to solicit the interesting result the client's looking for. Said another way, bad science. But they never said they were doing science. Shut up. It is wearing the skinned corpse of science to project authority. Seems pretty likely there's a reason they chose to omit the information I'm looking for, and I am quite frankly disgusted at anyone sharing it without a second thought. It's all one big disgusting cash grab. The PR firm for supplying data, the companies buying these studies to drive traffic to their sites in the hopes of converting it to a sale, the third party sharing these surveys because it's a trending topic in the hopes of gaining themselves more traffic without a care to the authenticity of the results. I hate it here. Now, where were we? Oh, right. Halfway through EndNote 4. The second reference is to the U.S. Health and Human Services press release about a 2022 study on kids' well-being. We can go straight to the source. There is, apparently, an annual national survey of children's health, sampling families from across the country by mail. The authors looked at trends in assorted measures from 2016 to 2020, so includes the start of COVID. We're going to focus on the measures relevant to Shrier's point. These plots are all measures of how children are doing, with year along the x-axis and the percent prevalence along the y. There was a significant increase in anxiety problems, not necessarily formal diagnoses, in the 2016 to 2020 time period. However, this seems to have been driven by the change between 2016 and 2019. The 2019 to 2020 difference was not significant. Depression problems have a similar story. A significant increase from the start to end years, but that trend was driven by the change prior to 2020. The one measure that saw a significant uptick between 2019 and 2020 was behavior or conduct problems, as reported by the kid's caregiver. How much of this is due to lockdown and the kid being in the caregiver's hair all day is not clear. Let's talk numbers now. The low end of anxiety problems was 7.1%, while the high was 9.2%. The starting depression rate was 3.1, ending 4%. Keep in mind both of these are the more conservative and inclusive problems, which, as shown in these supplemental survey items, allows the caregiver to positively endorse that their child is having anxiety or depression problems, even if there isn't a formal diagnosis. So, in 2020, the 3 to 17-year-olds are being rated as 9.2% having anxiety problems and 4% with depressive problems. That seems a far cry from the 42% diagnosed with something self-reported in this survey. How do we square these? When confronted with conflicting outcomes, one thing to do is to see what the broader research says. That can help indicate which data point is anomalous, especially when I have so many concerns with one of them. Given the IT company survey interviewed 20 to 24-year-olds, we're looking at a subset of adults in 2022. The CDC just so happens to have recently published data about the prevalence of anxiety and depression symptomology in 2022. Somewhat similar to the 2016 to 2020 data, the focus here isn't on diagnoses themselves, but the symptoms of those two major psych disorders. So if anything, this should give larger numbers than formal diagnoses as the symptoms precede getting a diagnosis, and not everyone will jump through the hoops to do so. The overall rates of anxiety symptoms in 2022 was 18.2%, and depressive symptoms at 21.4%. It's worth noting this includes symptoms ranging from mild to severe, with the majority being on the lighter end. If we only look at the youngest demographic, 18 to 29-year-olds, 26.6% have had any anxiety symptoms in the time frame, and 26.9% for depression. However, from the discussion, quote, although both question sets used to determine if a person is experiencing anxiety or depression symptoms have been validated, they are not a substitute for a clinical diagnosis. Also, the person might not have really understood what they were being asked, may not have answered honestly, and interviewers could potentially have influenced answers in some unknown way. Also, during filming, it occurred to me that a person may have some anxiety or depression symptoms, but they might not be profound enough or have enough symptoms for them to meet the diagnostic criteria for whichever condition. So just because they have some symptoms doesn't mean that they actually have the disorder itself. They just have some anxiety or depressive symptoms. Right. Okay, so that does potentially help guide how the pieces fit together. Given the 2022 CDC data, it's not outside the realm of possibility that 42% of the rising generation have some form of psychiatric diagnosis, especially when it includes ADHD, which is 11% of the population, although that also has some comorbidity with anxiety and depression, though. That said, I want to see actual studies on this, not just clickbait content spam propagated by shitty journalists. I looked, and the closest I could find were treatment rates for kids with diagnoses or diagnosis rates from well over a decade ago. Bringing this back to her claim, it seems weird she's included both. The way I'm uncharitably seeing this is she gets the startling 42% figure from a questionable source, then tries to bolster its credibility with the JAMA Pediatrics one, even though those rates don't come anywhere close to the 40s. Before moving on from these references, I want to highlight something missing from Shrier's book: how the parents and guardians and child rearers are doing themselves. Same plot configuration as the last figure from the 2022 JAMA paper. Time is along the horizontal axis, percent prevalence along the vertical. The percent of caregivers who rated their own mental health as very good or better dropped significantly in this time frame, with the trend starting before 2020. Likewise, the proportion of caregivers saying they were coping very well with the whole parenting thing dropped, from not quite 68% in 2016 to 60% in 2020. This rating significantly dropped between 2019 and 2020. So the caregivers aren't doing great, which probably isn't helping the well-being of their kids. This relationship is overlooked or omitted by Shrier in this book, limiting the role of caregivers as pushers of therapy. Claim, quote, 1 in 6 U.S. children aged 2 to 8 years old has a diagnosed mental, behavioral, or developmental disorder. Cool. We're just broadening the search wider. Reference 5 is a CDC website that summarizes survey data about children's mental health as reported by their caregivers between 2016 and 2019. So strange Shrier hasn't mentioned the first chunk of this, about the mental well-being of American kids. Specifically, that the majority of youths are okay. They're curious, persistent, and mostly in control of themselves. That's good. But, let's see if we can find this 1 in 6 figure. Oh, it's from an infographic. Of course it is. And practically plagiarized by Shrier to boot. Going back a page, we can find the diagnosis rates, with ADHD at 9.8%, anxiety at 9.4%, general behavioral problems 8.9%, and depression at 4.4%. They note the comorbidity I keep mentioning. They're putting the co-occurrence of depression and anxiety in roughly 3/4 of those with depression and half having those more general behavioral problems. Starting from anxiety, 1/3 of those kids also had behavioral problems and 1/3 also had depression. Prior to COVID, the rates of depression and anxiety were on the rise, mostly driven by increases in anxiety. Disturbingly, for how much Shrier argues what we're doing is too much, roughly 1/5 of these youths thought about ending their lives, and 1/10 had made an attempt. These are teens, kids, pushed past the brink of wanting to continue living. The 1 in 6 in text has the context of these categories of disorders starting before the age of 8. The next point discusses the change in proportions with age, such that ADHD, anxiety, and depression rates increase while behavioral problems drop off. This includes a note about limitations, like caregivers potentially not reporting accurately, either because the child hasn't been diagnosed for other existing disorders, or they don't have the best fit diagnosis yet. But yes, Shrier is correct that roughly 17% of the under 8 crowd has some mental, behavioral, or developmental disorder diagnosis. So things ranging from the psych disorders she has focused on, to learning difficulties like dyslexia, all the way to things present at birth like Down syndrome or cerebral palsy. I really want to hammer home just how broad this umbrella is, because it encapsulates so much more than the things she's arguing against. Unless she would argue that somebody with cerebral palsy shouldn't get physical therapy and have assistance to live independently. You can never know with her. Claim: Americans have a higher ADHD diagnosis rate than other countries, sitting around 10%. Reference 6 is to a 2018 NBC News piece about ADHD diagnosis rates. You'll note the subheader includes that, quote, better diagnosis may be a factor for why rates have gone up, although there is uncertainty for the exact cause. This brief piece is an interview with one of the authors for a paper about that topic published in JAMA Network Open. This study used data gathered by the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics Annual Health Survey and did find an overall increase in ADHD diagnoses. That was different for different genders, ethnicities, familial income levels, and geographical region. They note that a similar but smaller trend was also seen in the UK. The authors list some potential non-medical explanations for this increase. Doctors being more aware of ADHD so are better able to catch it, changes in the diagnostic criteria which removed a hyperactivity component, resulting in more girls being diagnosed, improved awareness of ADHD in the public, and better healthcare access under the Affordable Care Act. And importantly, quote, there is a common perception that ADHD is overdiagnosed in the US, but this perception was not supported by scientific evidence based on review of prevalence studies and research on the diagnostic process. They also note underlying etiological changes that could help explain the uptick. Specifically, quote, prenatal and perinatal risk factors, including preterm birth, low birth weight, maternal cigarette smoking, and maternal use of certain medications or illicit substances during pregnancy. There are also many environmental contaminants and nutritional deficiencies that can increase the likelihood of the child developing ADHD. The relative importance of all these risks needs to be established. If I had to guess, I'd say Shrier pulled reference 7 from reference 6's second page. It is to the 5th edition of the American Psychological Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, to support the worldwide prevalence rate being lower than in the US. I'll throw in here that a similarly designed study with similar data looking at the subsequent years found that the growth in diagnostic rates seems to have plateaued. So it's not that it's just going to keep going indefinitely. There's a limit. That may remind you of a similar leveling off that happened when left-handedness became destigmatized, or as we're seeing with the autism diagnosis rates now that it's more understood, better understood how it presents in girls and women. Back to Shrier. Yes, the statements are correct. A little over 10% of American youths have an ADHD diagnosis, which is higher than other countries. Shrier will chalk this up to big therapy, but there's other non-tinfoil hat explanations. Right off the bat, we may be effectively zeroing in on the accurate population estimate for ADHD rates, and it may end up being somewhere between 5 and 10%. And the variability may be due to different environmental pressures. In the US, in my estimation, a lot of those environmental pressures that we are baking into the system for the pre-18 crowd that other countries aren't, is how we've shifted to doing schools. No child left behind, teach to the test, gotta keep those test grades up if we're gonna keep our school funded. That is a huge disservice to many different populations who aren't like me and who could just do tests and book learning well. It's bad for people who want to go into trades, and so all of this written test stuff is bullshit. And it's also a disservice to people with various learning disabilities where this very specific form of regurgitative learning and testing just isn't going to be the best thing for them. And for them to buckle in and lock in, they need help. So if you're struggling in class because your attention wanders, you can't handle sitting still for the lectures, and have some trouble with executive function resulting in negative consequences at school, you're probably going to notice these things more if you're not able to go into something more hands-on. Couple all of that to the car-centric nature of the US and the loss of third spaces for youths to go be social and burn off some energy at, and it's no surprise that we have higher ADHD rates than elsewhere. But I would still argue that this 10% is probably a reasonable estimate for the population prevalence of ADHD, if forced into the cubicle prep culture we've got. Claim, quote, nearly 10% of kids now have a diagnosed anxiety disorder. Jesus fucking Christ, Shrier, cite the main thing. Reference 8 is a 2022 Georgetown University press release about a study we talked about in EndNote 4. The one that tried to suss out the effects of COVID on kids' mental health by examining survey data starting in 2016, ending in 2020. Recall that this measured anxiety problems, not diagnosis rates.
It would have been more accurate for Shrier to say that nearly 10% of kids now have anxiety problems, but that doesn't pack quite the same punch.
Claim. The youths include their psychiatric diagnoses in their social media profiles. Source. Shrier said so. Well, I'm glad she's not doxing some youth's TikTok accounts. She should have had something here. Like, here's a teen Reddit thread about what girls put in their bios. While Shrier may be inclined to say that including pronouns is indicative of mental illness, that's the closest I'm seeing to her claim in what is almost certainly a non-representative sample of youths, because what youths are using Reddit anymore? Claim disputed. Claim. More youths have psych disorders than have been diagnosed, according to mental health experts, who may have well been fictional for how non-existent the source is here. Dismissed. Claim. The rising generation are on more psych meds than ever. Once again, no reference, which is a glaring omission because papers weren't hard to find here. Youth psychotropic treatment rates have gone up, in the US as well as in Europe. This table is just for the US as of 2013 and includes the different categories of medication in the columns and psych disorders along the rows. Looking at just the highest rate for any medication, the developmental disorders are at the top with 42%, largely coming from a split between antidepressants and stimulants. In this paper, that includes things like autism, Tourettes, or general intellectual disability. They have pulled out ADHD, which generally falls under the umbrella otherwise. Apart from that, the group with the highest medication rate is ADHD, with 31% receiving any medication, and a large portion of that being some form of stimulant. The next largest group are those who have some self-reported suicidality at 27.1%. Given the nature of the problem, it's unsurprising the majority of medications employed are antidepressants. Relevant to Shrier's apparent concerns, looking at overall anxiety, about 12% are on something, with the exact what generally being an antidepressant for all included forms of anxiety. An interesting wrinkle is that the increased prescription rate doesn't necessarily mean that the youths are taking them. This 2017 study by Cook and others looked at the intersection of prescription utilization, the appropriateness of that prescription, and ethnicity, with data sourced from the Medical Expenditure Panel Survey, which gives a snapshot of healthcare utilization and costs. More white youths were filling significantly more psych meds than the other groups, 8.1% versus 5 and 3.4%, with the highest prescription type being stimulants, 6.2% in white youths. This figure is doing two things. On top are the decomposed adjusted use of prescribed medication rates. The white parts of the bars are for non-indicated use. In this context, that means the person wouldn't have met the diagnostic criteria for needing to be on the medication in the current year, but had the previous year. White youths were filling significantly more prescriptions in this category than Black or Latino youths. In the discussion, they note this could potentially be at least somewhat misleading, as somebody who is on medication that is successfully helping them would be counted as non-indicated treatment because they wouldn't be having the symptoms, so grain of salt there. The cross-shaded part of the bar above the y-axis are for indicated use prescriptions. This means the youth did have significant impairments or symptoms in the current year, so the medication was appropriately issued. White youths, again, had higher rates than the Black or Latino youths. Below the y-axis are the decomposed adjusted data for youths who did have significant impairment or symptoms, but aren't using a medication to help. Now, if we take all the shaded regions as indicating those who have active symptomology or impairment from their psych disorder, you can see the majority of youths are not taking medication. Roughly 10% of the 14.6% of white youth aren't, as well as 10.9% of the 13.7% Black youth, and 7.4% of the 9.6% in Latino youth. In the intro, the authors noted that youth utilization of these medications dropped with the introduction of black box warnings about the risk of increased suicidality, which also saw an increase in suicide attempts. Getting back to Shrier's unsupported claim, the prescription rate of psychiatric meds has gone up, but at least a portion of that lines up with the increase in ADHD diagnoses, and there's a good chance many youths aren't even taking the medications they're prescribed. Claim. Kids these days are getting more, quote, mental health accommodations in school and sports. Reference 9 is to a 2022 piece in The Feed, a Georgetown University publication focused on access and affordability in higher ed. Shrier's reference is relaying things said in an Inside Higher Ed post, and just what is her aversion to hunting things down to the original source? Why does it always feel like this find the lady sleight of hand with her referencing? The nature of these accommodations? The ability to attend medical appointments without penalty if scheduled during class time, Flexible attendance, including reduced course loads, extended deadlines, or the ability to attend class remotely, and quiet exam rooms and/or longer test periods. Quote, for psychological disabilities in particular, accommodations should be seen as a temporary solution. The idea here is that many accommodations are designed to be a bridge to help the student while they're getting treatment squared away for their psych disorder, with the intent that the accommodations won't be needed once that's done. Alternately, curriculum could be redesigned so that accommodations are no longer necessary, but, the odds of that happening seem pretty slim. But yes, Shrier is correct. Accommodation use has grown in higher ed. In part as an attempt to reduce the growing suicide rate, as noted in the original Inside Higher Ed piece, but not Shrier's relaying reference. Reference 10 is from the Harvard Business Review about top athletes helping drive a change in talking about mental health in their domain. Amusingly, the big point of this article is how to apply the lessons learned from the athletes to management practices. The youngest athletes mentioned, Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles, were both born in 1997, putting them at the leading edge of Zoomer. And also took their mental health accommodation on the international stage, so not quite high school students getting letters from their GP that they don't have to run because it hurts their self-esteem or whatever whack argument Shrier would make here. Hardly seems to fit the claim about the youths getting more accommodations in sports. Claim denied on lacking sufficient evidence. Claim the youths face less stigma for mental health treatments. Oh no? Reference 11 is from the New Hampshire Union Leader, 2022, about a local teen who is working with younger teens to help them be more okay talking about their psych disorders and seeking help. Quoting the teen from the article, a lot of what Gen Z does is making a joke about it, but making a joke about it isn't the same as asking for help. If jokes are the first step, that's fine, but eventually we need to encourage people to reach out for help. Shrier's claim is only really included if you assume the main teen is openly talking with younger students about their mental health difficulties because she doesn't feel stigmatic pressure not to. Weak, poor reference, claim quite possibly true, but dismissed from evidence provided. Especially when we go back to that study about not using medications I mentioned, where a good chunk of people not using the medications they were prescribed comes down to fear of negative perceptions. Kids are getting more, quote, emotional sensitivity from adults, whatever that is. Praise Jeebus, she included pages. Reference 12 is to the 2002 book, Paranoid Parenting, Why Ignoring the Experts May Be Best for Your Child by Frank Fioretti. Fioretti is a sociologist who has focused, in part, on this paranoid parenting idea. He's also been a free speech advocate since the 90s, argues against climate change, plus some unsourced stuff in the wiki about some hot takes about UK police we won't delve into further. In short, this guy is right up Shrier's expert alley. I have acquired this book, and as tempting as it is to dig down into claims on these pages and really pick them apart, we're going to take the road less traveled on this channel. The bigger, briefer picture. This book was published over 2 decades ago, warning of all the ways that experts were fucking up the rising generation, which at that time was mostly my generation, the ever-crapifying millennials. Most Zoomers weren't even a twinkle in their daddy's eye yet. In the pages Shrier cites, there's talk about the, quote, parental determinism of saying parents were responsible for every problem their kid has, instead of the even then current view of things being a complicated mishmash of nature and nurture, and therapeutic parenting, quote there, where parents have to focus on their kids' feelings at the detriment of everything else. And mostly millennials. Don't forget. If someone has been crying catastrophic wolf for decades on stuff that's not necessarily materializing, maybe we should just move on. Oh, and no. But hey, good news, Shrier. General trust in experts is probably at an all-time low, so congratulations. Claim more about the therapeutic parenting stuff. She doesn't even point us back to the Fioretti book. Lazy. Denied. Hearsay. Claim, quote, educated parents have begun employing therapeutic language to describe misbehavior. And note 13 is this monstrosity. It includes the details for the 2010 Slate article, as well as a snippet. The article focuses on people who were raised by shrinks, and questions if they're any different than those raised by not shrinks. You know, the leading example of someone pushing their book about being raised by Jungian psychologists has me absolutely thrilled at what's going to follow. The tangential side thought here relevant to Shrier is the part about average parents having adopted more authoritative approaches in parenting, which emphasizes the agency of the youth. Part of this involves trying to help them understand the why behind a received punishment. And I am highly critical of this claim about, quote, the average parent in the park being able to recite from the DSM. Bullshit. Proof or GTFO, because this ain't cute. The hedging of, quote, or at least acting as an amateur child therapist isn't salvaging it. Claim rejected. Needs something more solid than this anecdata. Bit of an umbrella claim. Any and all personality traits have been medicalized. Once again, sans reference, save the last two examples. Let's look at some of these, because I or my husband are in them. As we talked about previously in this book, shyness can be its own thing, but at a certain point of disruptiveness, it crosses over into psychological disorder territory, especially when paired up with weird or awkward. That's part of how autism can present in some people, quite possibly including myself. This isn't to say that people can't just be weird or shy and that's their thing. That absolutely can be the case, but for some of us, it's probably reflecting a psychological disorder. And that's okay. My husband, in all his ADHD splendor, cannot stand shirt tags, so he rips them out. Which makes buying him a new shirt more difficult since I can never find out the size for the old one, but at least he's comfy. I fully own my messy handwriting. That is what I do 95% of the time. I can write more neatly, given time and the impetus to care, as hopefully my patrons who get the thank you cards every month, $20 and up tier with an address, hopefully it's legible and you don't think it's terrible. But that is definitely different than dysgraphia, where a person cannot write well. Shrier. Conflating the two is no. These last two have references for, quote, relocation depression, replacing kids being sad after a locational change. She's pointing us to something in Medical News Today, 2023. Quote, though not a true clinical condition, relocation depression informally refers to a person experiencing an adjustment disorder. Adjustment disorders can resemble depression, tend to last a few months, and are triggered by major distress after a known stressor, like moving or changing schools. Most kids will probably get at least a little bummed about these things. This level of bummed crosses into clinical when it shuts them down. Yeah, I guess if you only treat the adjustment disorder with a pat on the back and it takes time to adjust to a new town or school, buddy, they will eventually get better, but they'll practically be clinically depressed until they do, so maybe we shouldn't minimize what they're going through and instead try to help them. Summer Anxiety gets a very well-mined article about the many potential anxiety pitfalls associated with the summer months. Once again, there's a sort of spectrum between normal missing friends over the summer to, oh no honey, how long has it been since you showered because you can't get out of bed? Not that missing friends is even in this thing. Altogether, for her whole list of medicalized normal traits or problems, claim is denied. There is scant or inappropriately applied support. Please think on the concept that any personality trait, when taken to an extreme, could be viewed as psychologically pathological if it interferes with daily functioning, is beyond the social norms, and causes either the person or those close with them significant distress. Shrier. These next claims are shared as, quote, Zeitgeist epitomizing stories. Claim, the American Academy of Pediatrics changed head lice protocol so that kids with them won't be sent home from school, implied by Shrier to be because the emotional well-being of the afflicted kid is more important than the non-afflicted kids. Support for this comes from a 2022 piece from The Hill. This piece shares info about the change Shrier described and points us to the official publication. The article, as noted by everyone in this discussion chain, represents the official protocol of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Basically, there isn't evidence supporting the necessity of sending kids home from school, as it's just not transmissible through the air, so kids should be allowed to attend once they've started treatment. Classmates' parents will be informed so they can keep an eye out on their kids, and additional precautions will be taken in the classroom. The article details the many treatment routes available, noting the relative strengths and weaknesses of them. This matches what the parents and teachers of my Discord have seen, even in the UK. While the basic claim Shrier made is supported by her reference, that the AAP isn't requiring kids with head lice be removed from school, the implied reason is not. The article does note the stigma, shame, and stereotypes associated with head lice, emphasizing they aren't warranted or true, but the reason behind the policy change is based on the science of head lice, how they spread, what safe containment looks like, and the best treatment approaches. It is not about these kids' BBs, Shrier. Although this appeal to disgust is more about Shrier's feelings, for sure. Claim, quote, "The Washington Post's mental health professional informed readers that having your name mispronounced is damaging to the psyche." You're not going to believe this. Well, if you've been watching this for a while, you probably will, but still. The audacity. Reference 17 is to fucking Twitter. Seriously. This is a thread from a licensed professional counselor in which she tries to get people to understand why screwing up the pronunciation of a person's name can wear them down over time. Shrier quotes two portions of the entire thread, most of the first post and the third, which includes the detrimental effect on the person. Shrier omits everything else. Why people should care, the acknowledgement that it likely isn't done intentionally and mistakes happen, some example scripts for how to talk to a repeat mispronouncer, and more thoughts about why this sucks and what to do. My maiden name is probably Polish in origin, and despite being pretty short, only was pronounced once correctly on the first try up until the day I got married and it got bumped into middle name status. The one teacher who got it right on the first try happened to know my dad, so it's kind of cheating, but I'll still give it to her. It kind of sucked, bracing for the inevitable butchering of my last name. But it was usually a one and done sort of thing because people just need to learn that you could trust how it's spelled and not try to insert phonemes for some reason. I can imagine having something more complicated, where the brute force English phonetics fails, would result in more repetitions. Even more so if it's a person's first name. Shrier is almost certainly discounting how draining this can be on a person over time. As some anecdata, I know many Chinese students and postdocs who adopt an English name just to stop the butchering of the Chinese, like, please. And the two professors I had in undergrad who are Russian forbade us from using their last name. It was first name only, like, no, he's fine. First name, no. So yeah, Abigail Shrier, this counselor, did talk about the harm to a person's psyche in the context of her own experience. While Shrier doesn't misrepresent the claim, I'm still going to withhold a full approval because the subtext is hella sus. Claim. An NYU chemistry professor was fired for, quote, holding pre-med students to the same standards and grading scale he'd employed for decades, which suddenly failed to make student well-being a priority. Reference 18 is a New York Times piece about an organic chemistry professor whose contract wasn't renewed after the school received a petition from students wanting him to change his approach. They did not want him fired. From reading through it, and having a strong aversion to chemistry, I don't know if this professor authored the, quote, premier text as Shrier claims. He wrote a no-chem book, sure, but I don't know if it's top dog. Basically, this professor had already retired from teaching chemistry at Princeton and was teaching at NYU on yearly contracts. And the chairman of his department noted that this guy hadn't updated his approach in years. Core point. Yes, this guy's contract was not renewed, which, pedantically, not the same thing as being fired. After some students made some noise about his classes being too hard and him not offering accommodations like having access to Zoom classes or more than 2 tests a semester. Having been on both sides of this, I have some thoughts. There are, and absolutely should be, standards in higher ed. However, as instructors, we have to acknowledge that our lectures and our tests aren't perfect reflections of some immutable knowledge threshold. The best middle ground we have for this is a reasonable expectation of some level of mastery students need to demonstrate in order to pass a class. And if they don't demonstrate that, they fail. And that's fine. However, that fineness in failing requires that it not be incredibly cost prohibitive or detrimental for the students to have failed. Like at my undergrad, it was relatively normal for students to fail a class here or there. However, I was on a full ride scholarship and Pell Grant that required I maintain a certain GPA. And this was in the days before Blackboard and online learning things, so I had no idea what my physics and calc grade were. So I was sweating bullets that I was going to slip below the GPA threshold and be financially fucked. Coincidentally, partway through the school year, I thought about chucking myself off the dorm's balcony. Wasn't good. Also, said undergrad's classes weren't that expensive and the tuition wasn't bad. Yeah, it sucks to have to retake a course like that, but it wasn't the end of the world. And I'd hazard a guess that these "it's fine to fail" conditionals are no longer true at most schools, probably doubly so at NYU. So then I'd suggest that maybe this isn't so much a reflection of the rising generation being too emotional about failing a class, as it is the educational system and constraints having changed so that failure is no longer an option. That many students are staring off their own balconies, considering all the costs associated with failing a class. Yeah, OChem is a weeder class for med school on some level. You have to do a lot of hard work to absorb a lot of just crystallized information, and that reflects a lot of the hard work you're going to see in med school. And if you can't crack it at OChem, that's fine. It's better to find out then than after you've tried and failed at med school. There's other things you can do to scratch that wanting to help people itch, and that's fine. Not everybody's going to be a doctor. But, to say it again with different phrasing, the educational system needs to not be punitive towards these students, to borrow the phrasing used by Shrier's own Times reference. It's easy to pin the blame on complaining students, but this guy's own chair was pretty lukewarm about him and his teaching approach in the Times article. Like, your own chair isn't really willing to go to bat for you. The department may have been toying with not renewing his contract anyways, and the opportunity presented itself. We close out this section with, to be blunt, more Shrier complaining about how famous people have helped to normalize something that roughly, at least, a fifth of people will experience in their lives. Final claim, quote, 75 years of rapid expansion in mental health treatment and services has landed us here, marveling at the unprecedented psychological frailty of American youth. That highly specific 75 years is her lead into the next section, and because it's a season of kindness and giving, I won't ding her for not supporting that claim here, as she does in the start of the next section. In her way, needless to say, we will cross that reference bridge when we get there, because this channel is all about demonstrating Brandolini's law and the time required to go through not great claims, even when supported with some sort of reference, so this video is at about the max length I can handle. But before we call it for today, let's tabulate how she did with her claims. One claim I can approve without any hedging or contextualization. Gen Z are receiving more academic accommodations than previous generations. Contrary to why Shrier likely included this, though, is this does not then indicate that Gen Z as a generation are different. College is more of a requirement than it had been, and there's greater awareness and acceptance of the struggle that can happen in higher ed, and there's more pathways and tools to help. So even something as straightforward as this still needs a bit of extra detail given Shrier's core argument. 3 of the 18 claims were basically correctly included, used, and represented by Shrier. Basically, Gen Z has received more mental health treatment than older generations. 1 in 6 kids has a diagnosed mental, behavioral, or developmental disorder, and ADHD diagnoses are higher in the US than other countries. But here come the caveats. There's more mental health treatments available now, and greater awareness and acceptance in using them. The 1 in 6 bin includes so much more than the things Shrier likely cares about in this book. I don't understand why she included this one. And yeah, ADHD diagnoses are higher here, but there's so many potential explanations for that besides big pharma and big therapy colluding to get kids addicted to legal speed, or even that the parents don't want a parent. Okay, so 22% of her claims hold water, for the most part. That's troubling. 5 claims are in the not good but not bad box. The first because the survey data threw up enough red flags for me to be suspicious and wanting to see it independently verified, especially when the other reference for the claims seemed to contradict it. The second, because the survey asked parents about anxiety problems their kids were having in addition to a diagnosis, so it isn't factually accurate to say it's that figure. The third, because while the head lice protocol did in fact change, it was because the scientific consensus is that actively treating the affected child is sufficient. It's not out of fear for what emotional backlash the kid will face. Quarantine the kid isn't necessary. The fourth, because calling this writer, quote, the Washington Post's mental health professional, which suggests this is her assigned position there instead of being an advice columnist, is incredibly misleading, and as quoted by Shrier, discards important context for the nature of the psychological harm in having your name mispronounced. And finally, the fifth, because one, the guy wasn't fired, but perhaps more importantly, it ignores the larger context of why the students put in the petition for things to change, not to have his contract go unrenewed, and the systemic issues behind all of it. And then 4 claims were entirely pulled out of air, and 1 I'm letting slide until the next section. The remaining 5 are in the naughty bin. Her support for athletic accommodations only talked about 2 Gen Z athletes who took a pause for their mental health. It's unreasonable to use that as evidence for all youth. I'm not even sure why she cited the article she did for reduced mental health stigma. Literally, the focal point of the story was a teen girl going around and talking about her experiences so those younger than her would hopefully feel less bad about their own mental health struggles. I.e., there's still stigma. This emotional sensitivity thing is an alarm bell that's been rung long enough to have broken off the holder from a sus sociologist. The therapeutic language is coming out of a story about people raised by therapists with an offhand comment about lay parents being able to recite the DSM because the writer said they can. No. Finally, a combo of the majority of Shrier's examples of personality traits being pathologized are given without support, and the 2 that do get citations, Shrier blows right past the point to make her argument about how ridiculous it all is. While I do commend her for bringing in support for her arguments, which is more than can be said of a certain Canadian psychologist, it's disappointing how few are either appropriate or used appropriately. And even then, in almost every instance, I had to hunt down the actual source material instead of the several steps removed summarized versions she cited. Granted, her background is in law, not psychology, biology, medicine, or whatever else is relevant. But I would hope somebody writing a book called Bad Therapy could muster up enough literacy to be able to read the original source material instead of having it regurgitated and fed to her like a little baby bird, trusting that whoever's doing the chewing up has included all the important context and caveats for her to pass on to us. Stay tuned for the next Shriering, where we will pick up with the treatment prevalence paradox, smartphones, lockdown for COVID, and climate change. Until next time, bye.